They said I was insane for giving it all away. $40 million gone, vanished in a single morning, and, in return, I received a certificate that legally declared my collection unsellable. The press called it a breakdown. A midlife tantrum disguised as philanthropy. But what none of them understood was that I didn't lose anything that day. I simply refused to let greed be my legacy. X interdit. Watched them tear each other apart for that money, family, friends, investors, and I realized late that love had a price tag in their eyes. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I turned my fortune into art no one could ever profit from. It all began 5 years earlier, in a room that smelled faintly of new paint and cheap wine. I had just sold my second tech company for $38 million, a figure that made my mother cry and my father grin in the way only old money men grin, like they were proud, but mostly relieved. You've done it, Ethan, me untouchable that night. You're finally one of us. One of asterisk us, the word stuck to me like tar. My family wasn't rich in the warm, generous sense. They were rich in the kind of way that demanded evidence scars, marble kitchens, and property deeds engraved with our last name. They spoke in the language of investments and philanthropy dinners, where compassion was a brand and generosity came with photographers. My mother, delicate and immaculately dressed, leaned over her glass of Merlot and said softly, "Now you can start giving back, darling. But do it properly through the foundation, of course." The foundation was a family-run machine that polished our reputation with money soaked in self-interest. Every donation came with a press release, every charitable act a tax deduction. I smiled, because that's what you did when you didn't want to argue. But I felt the first sting of something, then a quiet disgust that would grow, slow and relentless, like rust beneath gold leaf. In those early years, I tried to play along. I attended their charity galas, where bored millionaires compared their watches and made pledges they'd forget by dessert. I smiled for cameras, toasted with flutes of champagne that tasted of emptiness, and nodded when people said things like, "You're doing such noble work, Ethan." But something changed the night I met Hermara Quinn. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't on the guest list, at least not in the social sense. She was a curator for the city's modern art museum, invited by my mother to discuss potential sponsorship. She wore a black dress without a single diamond and spoke about art the way I once spoke about ideas, like it could still change the world. "You don't believe in what they're selling, do you?" she asked me that night. Her voice steady as she watched me swirl my drink instead of drinking it. I blinked. "What makes you say that?" "Because you haven't looked at a single person in this room the way you're supposed to," she said, tilting her head. "You're looking through them." "That's the look of a man who's already seen the ending." I laughed, though it came out hollow. "You're bold for someone who wants funding." "I don't want your money," she said simply. "I want your attention. And maybe your honesty, if you still have some left." I remember the pause between us then. The soft hum of a string quartet and the faint scent of jasmine from her perfume. She had disarmed me with words sharper than any accusation my family could have made. We talked until midnight about beauty, creation, and what art could mean if stripped of ownership. By the time she left, I realized something dangerous. I admired her more than anyone in that room. Over the next year, Amara became the axis around which my discontent spun. She invited me to the museum's quiet halls after hours, where unfinished sculptures waited in dim light. I began buying art not for prestige, but for connection. Pieces that spoke to grief, loneliness, rebellion. She taught me that the value of art wasn't in its price, but in its capacity to make people feel asterisk. But as my collection grew, so did the whispers. My father called it reckless spending. My business partner, Nolan, accused me of losing focus. "You're bleeding cash into dead paint," he said one afternoon in my office, slamming a folder on my desk. "You could flip those pieces in a year and double your return. What are you doing?" "I'm not buying them to sell them," I said quietly. He laughed. "Then you're buying them to die with them asterisk?" "Because that's all they'll be, dust in some climate-controlled vault." I looked at him then, realizing he didn't see art, just opportunity. "Maybe that's the point," I said. Maybe not everything needs to turn into profit. He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. That's when I knew I'd crossed. An invisible line, the one that separated me from the rest of them. A year later, Amara died in a car crash. It was a fog-drenched morning, the kind that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. She was on her way to deliver a lecture titled Ownership and the Death of Art. I never made it to the funeral. I couldn't. Instead, I sat alone in her favorite gallery room staring at her panes of glass. An oil piece that looked like it was reaching for something forever out of reach. After that, something broke loose in me. I stopped attending family dinners. I stopped checking my accounts. I spent months designing something Amara had once theorized, a museum that couldn't be bought. When it finally the reaction came like a storm. My mother cried again, but not the proud kind of tears this time. My father called it betrayal. Nolan threatened lawsuits. You can't just erase wealth, Ethan. Eshuted. Money doesn't disappear just because you *1* it to mean something else. But I did. I found a way. With a team of lawyers and curators, I created a legal trust that reclassified every piece I owned as unsellable. Cultural heritage, meaning it could never again be traded, auctioned, or inherited. My transform museum of war often not free of easy, but impossible to un. When the documents were signed, the balance in my account fell to near zero. I remember feeling, for the first something like peace. The next morning, the headline screamed billionaire burns his fortune for art they speculated madness, guilt, drugs, even a cult. My family refused to speak to me. Nolan tried to sue, but the structure held airtight. And yet, when I walked through the museum that first night, alone except for the faint echo of my footsteps, I swear I heard Amara's voice whisper through the halls. Now they can't sell what they'll never understand. Outside, people gathered, some curious, some angry, some moved to tears. I stood behind the glass and watched them as they looked upon art that could never again be possessed. In that moment, I knew I'd done the right thing. I hadn't destroyed my wealth. I had freed. But freedom, I would soon learn, carries its own kind of price. They came for me within. Gag. Lawyers first, then reporters, and finally the vultures in silk, the kind of men who never step into sunlight without an agenda. Tekaladita breach of economicalism, a psychotipus brought on by grief. They dissected my decision like it was a disease. I didn't fight them. I didn't need to. Every document had been crafted with surgical precision, and the museum's charter was legally unbreakable. Still, it didn't stop them from trying. My father sent a representative to my doorman named Briggs, his jaw carved from arrogance, his suit the color of debt. Mr. Halberg, he began, stepping into my living room without invitation. Your father wants to offer you an opportunity to undo this situation. Undo, I repeated, leaning against the doorway. You make it sound like I spilled coffee on the economy. He didn't smile. You've trapped $40 million in assets that no longer hold liquid value. You've effectively burned capital that could have been reinvested. I didn't burn anything, I said, interrupting him. I preserved it. Teriosa. Difference, he sighed, the kind of sigh men use when they think you're a child. Your father is willing to restore your financial standing, but he wants assurances that this philanthropic spectacle won't continue. I looked at him, then really looked. Tell my father he can keep his money, I said quietly. And his reputation. I've already given both of mine away. Briggs stared at me, his lips curling in that faint, disdainful way I knew so well. You know what people are calling you, he said finally, the mad benefactor. They're laughing at you, Ethan. Then let them laugh, I said, turning away. Laughter's the cheapest thing they've got left. He left without another word. I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the long, tree-lined drive. For a moment, I thought about calling my father, explaining, apologizing, but the silence between us had calcified long ago. The museum opened 2 days later. I hadn't planned an opening ceremony, but the world forced one upon me. Cameras lined the street, journalists pressed against the glass, and protesters held signs that said art is for everyone, not egos. The irony made me laugh. Inside, the hall shimmered beneath soft light. Each piece had been placed exactly where Amara would have wanted it and claimed, unpriced, free. The first visitors trickled in hesitantly, like pilgrims entering a sacred ruin. I watched them from the upper balcony, unseen. A child pointed at one of the sculptures asterisk, the weight of greed asterisk, a bronze figure hunched under a pile of gold-plated stones. Why doesn't anyone own it? The boy asked his mother. Because it belongs to everyone, she said softly. That moment, more than anything, justified it all. But peace never lasts. Within weeks, investors began circling, like sharks smelling blood in the water. Pateo Ferretto partner with them lease for emissions. One even suggested converting part of the building into an immersive NFT gallery experience. I refused them all. Then came the threats. Anonymous letters slipped under my door at night, messages left on my phone in distorted voices. You think you can take from us and hide behind art, one said. Money doesn't disappear, Ethan. It finds its way home. I ignored them at first, thinking they were just desperate collectors. But then I found my mailbox smashed. And the museum's security alarms tripped at 3 a.m. The guards reported seeing figures in black moving between the trees, watching. The board-eyed appointed academics, curators, and artists grew nervous. You've made enemies of powerful people, said Dr. Lee, one of Amara's old colleagues. They'll find a way to destroy what you built, legally or not. Let them try, I said. They can't buy what no one owns, but deep down, I knew she was right. A month later, the first major blow landed. Nolan, my former business partner, filed a lawsuit claiming I had diverted company assets into personal ventures before my collapse. It was a lie, but a convincing one. He'd always known how to twist truth into profit. The media ate it up. The same outlets that once called me a visionary now labeled me a self-destructive narcissist. News anchors debated my sanity. Psychologists speculated about grief-induced illusion. I stopped leaving the museum altogether. I lived in the caretaker's quarters, surrounded by the art that had once been my salvation. But the isolation began to weigh on me. I'd walk the halls at night, barefoot, tracing my fingers along the cold frames and sculptures. Sometimes I swore the paintings asterisk watched asterisk me back. It was on one of those nights that I met Hermora, the museum's newest volunteer. She was young, maybe 24, with ink-stained hands and eyes that carried the same quiet fire I'd once seen in Amara. She didn't recognize me at first. Most people didn't anymore. You shouldn't be here alone, she said. Stepping into the hall, where I stood before asterisk cans of glass. Asterisk, I live here, I replied. She tilted her head. You're the founder, aren't you? I nodded. I thought you'd be older, she said with a faint smile. Or angrier. I couldn't help but laugh. Give it time. We began talking after that, small exchanges at first, then long conversations about meaning, creation, loss. She reminded me of what I'd once been before all this, curious, stubborn, hopeful, but as our conversations deepened, so did the unease. One night, I caught her in the restricted archive room, staring at the original trust documents. What are you doing? I asked. She jumped, the papers trembling in her hands. I was just curious. I wanted to understand how it works. How you made it all untouchable. I studied her expression, part guilt, part fascination. You're not the first to ask that question, I said quietly. But most people want to know, because they're trying to undo it. Her eyes flicked toward me. And what if someone asterisk did asterisk undo it? I mean, would you care? I'd burn it all before I let them have it, I said. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she smiled faintly. You sound like an artist yourself. Maybe I was, I said. Once, that night, long after she left, I stared at the security feed, replaying her movements. The way she'd lingered over the documents. The way she'd touched the signature page. I told myself it was nothing, just curiosity, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The next morning, I found one of the gallery's pieces missing. Not stolen, asterisk, replaced. Asterisk, in its place stood a flawless replica. Indistinguishable, except for one small detail, at the bottom corner. Carved so faintly, it could only be seen in certain light. Were the words, asterisk, asterisk, you can't cage beauty forever. Asterisk, asterisk, panic hit me like a blow to the chest. I stood frozen, in front of the sculpture asterisk, the weight of greed asterisk, its bronze surface gleaming under the gallery lights. So perfect it took me a full minute to see it wasn't the original. My breath quickened as I leaned closer, tracing the inscription with my fingertip. The engraving was deliberate, meticulous, and mocking. Whoever had done this hadn't stolen for money. They'd done it for asterisk meaning asterisk. I locked down the museum. Security was doubled, and I called in every curator and staff member for questioning. Mara arrived last, her expression unreadable. Someone's replaced one of the main pieces, I said flatly. Do you know anything about it? Her brow furrowed, but there was no surprise in her voice. No, what do you mean replaced? I mean it's not the same sculpture, I snapped, gesturing toward the bronze figure. That's a forgery. A perfect one, but still fake. She stepped closer, examining it with genuine awe, convincing curiosity. It looks identical. That's the problem. She turned to face me, her gaze calm. Then how do you know it's fake? Because I asterisk remembered. Asterisk because I had spent nights sitting before this very sculpture, studying every imperfection, every tool mark the artist had left like fingerprints. But I couldn't tell her that. I couldn't tell anyone how deeply I'd memorized these pieces, how each one had become a confession. I whispered to Amara's ghost. Instead, I said, because I made sure I would. Mara said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, maybe someone's sending you a message. I stared at her. You think I don't know that? Her eyes softened. No, I think you're ignoring what it means. That night, I reviewed every security tape from the last 72 hours. Nothing. No intrusions. No movement. After hours, no alarms. It was as if the sculpture had simply asterisk changed itself. Asterisk, and yet the engraving haunted me asterisk you can't cage beauty forever. Asterisk a week passed before the second piece vanished. This time it was one of Amara's favorites asterisk dust of faith asterisk, a minimalist painting composed of black sand trapped beneath a thin layer of glass. The replica was immaculate again, but under the ultraviolet light. I found another engraving hidden in the corner. Asterisk asterisk art docent T belong T asterisk asterisk. You've made enemies of powerful people, said Dr. Lee, one of Amara's old colleagues. They'll find a way to destroy what you built, legally or not. Let them try, I said. They can't buy what no one owns. But deep down, I knew she was right. A month later, the first major blow landed. Nolan, my former business partner, filed a lawsuit claiming I had diverted company assets into personal ventures before my collapse. My stomach turned cold. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing games. They knew me intimately. I called a private meeting with Dr. Lee, the museum board chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the latest inscription. This is escalating, she said. If they can replace works without detection, it means they have inside access. I know, I said, my voice low. Her eyes lifted to mine. You're thinking of the volunteer, aren't you? I hesitated. She's unusual. Curious about things most people wouldn't even notice. Dr. Lee leaned forward. Do you trust her? I don't trust anyone, I said, and I meant it. But suspicion wasn't proof. And yet, that night, I followed Mara. She stayed late again, claiming to be cataloguing new donations. I watched from the mezzanine as she moved through the dim galleries. Her flashlight beam dancing across the art. Then she stopped before Hands of Glass, her favorite. Amara's favorite. I held my breath as she reached out and placed her palm gently against the surface of the glass hands. I know what you're trying to do, she whispered. The words echoed faintly through the silent hall. Something in me cracked open. I descended the stairs quietly, my footsteps soundless on the marble floor. And what is that? I asked from behind her. She turned, startled but not afraid. You think you can trap beauty here, keep it frozen, because you're afraid it'll fade. But that's not privation. That's emprisonnement. You don't understand, I said. This was never about control. Then what was it about? Je demandais. Proving you were different from them, from your family, from the world that made you rich. I flinched. It was about freedom. Whose? She asked softly. For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Her eyes sharp, searching felt like judgment and mercy all at once. Amara believed in liberation through art, she continued, not in locking it behind museum glass. You twisted her dream into a shrine for your guilt. The sound that left me was half laugh, half gasp. You don't know her. She stepped closer. Maybe not. But I know what obsession looks like. The air between us thickened with silence. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then she said something that made every muscle in my body tense. She wanted people to see Ethan, not you, to decide who's worthy of seeing. My voice broke when I said it, and yet, here you are, seeing. Her expression softened for the briefest moment. Maybe that's why I'm here. I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. The next morning, she was gone, her volunteer ID left on the front desk. No note, no forwarding address, nothing, just absence. Betrayal. Later, the third piece disappeared. This time, they didn't leave a replica, just an empty pedestal. The engraville, a timbre black red parchment. Freedom isn't ownership, it's release, no signature. I locked myself in the curator's office for hours, the plaque cold in my hand. My thoughts spiraled. Mara, Amara, Nolan, my father each one a ghost tugging at the edges. Off mi sanity. That night, I walked through the museum again, each echo of my footsteps taunting me. The walls seemed to close in, the paintings leaning closer, their colors flickering in the dim, emergency lights. And that's when I saw it. At the end of the main hall, under the grand skylight, stood a new sculpture, one I had never seen before. A human, figure half bronze, half. Shattered glass kneeling, as if in supplication. Its face was fractured, but somehow familiar. I stepped closer, my pulse roaring in my ears. At its base was an inscription carved into the stone, for Ethan Halberg, the man who tried to own freedom. I dropped to my knees, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space. And for the first time since I'd given it all away, I felt the true weight of what I'd done, not as sacrifice, not as rebellion, but as confession. I don't remember standing up. One moment, I was on my knees before that impossible sculpture, and the next, I was stumbling backward, gasping for air that suddenly felt too heavy to breathe. The skylight, Baba flickered the recent glow, but the muse darde versinit. Every shadow looked alive, every silence like it was waiting for me to understand something terrible I'd missed. The sculpture's face, my face stared at me from 1,000 fractured reflections. I could see myself in each shard, the idealist, the traitor, the fool, the savior. All of them trapped, just like the odd I'd sworn to protect. I whispered, who did this? But the whole swallowed my voice. In the days that followed, I stopped answering calls, emails, everything. Reporters were camping outside the gates now, demanding statements. Is the collection being stolen? Is the museum haunted? Are you having another breakdown? Let them speculate. The truth was, I didn't know what to believe anymore. Dr. Lee tried to intervene, but I wouldn't let her inside the restricted galleries. You need rest, she said over the phone, her voice soft but firm. You're unraveling. Ethan, I'm not unraveling. I told her. I'm being rewritten. That made her pause. By who? I don't know yet. At night. I dreamed of Amara. Always the same dream. She stood in the gallery, barefoot. Her hand pressed against the glass of asterisk cans of glass. Asterisk, when I called to her, she turned to me, her face serene but her eyes disappointed. You misunderstood me, she'd say, voice echoing from nowhere and everywhere. You built a tomb, not a temple. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the words still ringing in my head. It was the museum that finally broke its silence. The power went out one evening, just as the sun disappeared behind the city skyline. The emergency lights failed too. Trigger. For the first time since its creation, my museum was completely dark. I reached for my phone, but the screen flickered and died. I found an old flashlight and moved through the halls, the beam slicing through the void like a blade. And then footsteps, slow, bare, coming from the central gallery. Who's there? My voice cracked against the silence. No reply, just the steady rhythm of feet against marble. Closer, closer until they stopped. I raised the flashlight. The beam landed on the bronze and glass sculpture. But it wasn't the same anymore. The face was different. The fractures had shifted. The mirrored shards rearranged into something new, no longer me. Her, Amara. I stumbled backward. No, that's impossible. But the light flickered, and for a fraction of a second, I saw movement in the reflection, her eyes blinking, her mouth parting as if she were about to speak. The flashlight fell from my hand and rolled across the floor, the beam spinning wild circles of light. And then I heard it. Frida Nemsens Ferilis, the Vazentins room. It was the risky fushing making. Amara. Silence. I stepped closer again, trembling, every nerve alive with disbelief. The sculpture gleamed under the erratic light. And at the base freshly carved, still damp with bronze dust were new words. Asterisk, asterisk, you can still change what this means. Asterisk, asterisk. I don't remember what happened next. My memories splinter into flashes me, running through the hallways, opening sealed archives, tearing through storage crates like a madman. I found every piece that had been replaced, every forgery that had mocked me. I smashed them all. Bronze split, glass shattered. The alarms blared to life. Security guards shouted. But I didn't stop. Because somewhere in that chaos, I understood. I had turned art into a prison, not to save it, but to save asterisk myself, asterisk to preserve the only thing that still felt pure in a world that had rotted under money and power. But by trying to control it, I'd become everything I'd hated. Deep in the quiet, I heard her voice again, not as accusation, but as grace now. Ethan, let it go. So I did. I turned away from the past and walked out into the fading light, where the museum's reflection shimmered in the glass like a memory that no longer belonged to me. And for the first time, I truly understood what freedom meant. Rain began to fall as I stepped out of the museum, soft at first, then relentless, washing the city in silver. I didn't have an umbrella. I didn't care. Each drop felt like absolution, a quiet cleansing of everything I'd built and broken. I walked with no destination, just forward, through the blur of headlights and reflections, until the museum disappeared behind me like a dream, fading at dawn. I ended up on the riverfront, the same place Amara used to take me, when she needed to breathe the noise out, as she called it. The benches were slick with rain, the river swollen and restless beneath the streetlights. I sat down anyway, my coat soaked through, my breath coming in slow, deliberate pulls. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like Ethan Halberg, the founder, the millionaire, the lunatic. I was just a man trying to remember what it felt like to live without control. A voice broke through the rain. Did you ever think it would end like this? Première looked up. Mara stood a few feet away, hood drawn, hair dripping, her eyes catching the light like wet glass. For a second, I thought she was another ghost conjured by guilt, another hallucination born from sleepless nights. But then she smiled, tired, human, real. You're here. I sighed, half whisper, half disbelief. Shouldn't dead? And stepped closer. I heard about the reopening. They renamed it, I said quietly. The Amara Quinn Collection. I know. She sat beside me, close enough for our shoulders to almost touch. She would have liked that. For a moment, we just listened to the rain. Then I asked the question that had haunted me since she vanished. Was it you? Erbro furrowed slightly. The replacements, the engravings, the messages. Mara didn't answer immediately. She just stared out at the river, raindrops tracing lines down her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Does it matter? Yes, I said, more forcefully than I intended. It matters because it means I wasn't losing my mind. Unreadable. You weren't losing your mind. Ethan, you were losing your chains. Something in me broke again quietly this time. Why? I asked. Why go through all that? Because you couldn't see what you'd done to yourself, she said. You thought by making art unsellable, you'd purified it, but you were still trying to own the purity. Unevdo. Let it live again, even if that meant letting it go. You made me think I was going insane, I said bitterly. She gave a faint, sad smile. Sometimes we have to break the illusion before the truth can breathe. The river hissed louder as the rain thickened. Lightning flashed in the distance, and for an instant I saw her face illuminated, strong, defiant, alive. She looked like Amara that night in the museum years ago. The same conviction, the same quiet rebellion. Was it just you? I asked. She hesitated. No, there were others. Artists, restorers, people who believed in what you started but not in how you ended it. We didn't steal anything. We set it free. I closed my eyes. You could have told me. You wouldn't have listened. She was right. Of course she was. Right. When I opened my eyes again, she was standing, the rain sliding off her like silk. The world doesn't need another man guarding beauty from itself. Ethan, she said, it needs someone who believes people can still deserve it, and you think that's me? She gave a small, knowing smile. I think it could be. She turned to leave, then paused. We kept one piece untouched, she said. Amara's favorite. Asterisk hands of glass. Asterisk you should see it. Before I could respond, she was gone, her figure dissolving into the rain, leaving only her words hanging in the air, like the echo of a promise. I went back to the museum at dawn. The city was still half asleep, the streets veiled in mist. No one stopped me as I entered. The guards recognized me, but didn't question my return. The main hall was empty, quiet, different, the kind of silence that feels sacred instead of sterile. And there it was, asterisk hands of glass. Asterisk I approached slowly. The sculpture stood beneath the same skylight where I'd first seen my reflection, fractured and reborn. The glass hands reached upward, open now, no longer trapped within the frame. Someone had removed the encasing entirely, letting the air touch it, the light play through its curves. At its base was a single line, freshly engraved in gold. Freedom begins when we stop trying to hold what was never ours. I touched the cool glass fingers. And for the first time, they didn't feel distant. They felt alive. I saw my reflection again, but not shattered this time. Whole, human. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for sunlight to pour through the skylight, refracting through the sculpture until the entire whole shimmered with color pinks, golds, blues. It felt like standing inside a heartbeat. And that's when I realized the museum wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a living organism. Changing, adapting, breathing with every person who walked its halls. Just as Amara had wanted, just as Mara had reminded me. I left before the first visitors arrived. I didn't need to stay. It no longer needed me. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled clair comme new. I turned toward the sunrise, and for the first time in my life, I felt no weight on my shoulders, no guilt, no burden, no need to preserve what was already eternal. Amara's voice echoed one, last time in my memory. Love and art die when you try to keep them, but as the light broke over the horizon, I finally understood the part I had never heard before. But they live again when you let them go. And so I walked into the day, nameless, unburdened, no longer the man who tried to own freedom, but the one who finally learned what it meant to live it. I left the city a week later. No announcements, no goodbyes, not even a note to the board. I packed a single bag, locked the door of my apartment for the last time, and took the first train heading nowhere in particular. The museum would go on without me now, stronger for my absence, finally untethered from the name that had once tried to define it. The rhythm of the train lulled me into thought. The landscape blurred into watercolor, endless fields, power lines stretching like veins across the horizon. I watched my reflection in the window, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a stranger staring back. I stopped in a small coastal town, one of those places where time seemed to move slower, where the air smelled of salt and wood smoke. No one recognized me, and that anonymity felt like a gift. I rented a room above a bookstore run by an old couple who never asked questions. Days slipped into a kind of peace I hadn't known was possible. Première began. Painting again. Not for show, not for money, just to see what would happen when my hands moved, without agenda. My first piece was a mess, wild strokes of ochre and black, smeared by impatience. The second, calmer. The third, alive. By the fifth, I realized something profound. Art had never been about preservation or permanence. It was about conversation. Each brush stroke whispered something only the next could answer. Sometimes I thought about Amara, about the way she'd smile mid-sentence as if her words were chasing something bigger than language. Other times, I thought about Mara and the quiet defiance in her eyes when she told me I'd turned art into a tomb. Both women lived in the space between who I'd been and who I was becoming. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I walked to the pier. The ocean was calm, a vast mirror of orange and violet. I sat on the edge, feet dangling above the water, sketchbook open on my lap. I drew without thinking, lines flowing as if they already existed, and I was just uncovering them. When I was done, I looked at what I'd made. It was a pair of hands open, reaching, unfinished. I laughed softly. "You're still teaching me." I said aloud, not sure if I was talking to Amara, or to something else entirely. Behind me, footsteps approached. "Light, deliberate, beautiful," a voice said. I turned. A woman stood there, perhaps in her 30s, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. She wore a linen coat the color of sand and had eyes that seemed to hold questions rather than judgments. "Sorry," she said, smiling. "Didn't mean to startle you. I've seen you sketching here the last few evenings. Thought you might want some company." I hesitated, then nodded. "Company's fine." She handed me a cup. "It's just coffee," she added, not a metaphor. I chuckled. "That's a relief." We sat in silence for a while, sipping, watching the waves. "You're not here from?" "Here," she said eventually. "No," I replied. "Just passing through." She glanced at the sketchbook. "Artist?" "Trying to be human first," I said. Her smile deepened. "Aren't we all?" We didn't exchange names that night. We didn't need to. The world had been built on too many names, too many labels. Sometimes the absence of definition was what made things real. As the sky darkened, she rose to leave. "I come here most evenings," she said. "If you want to talk again, I might," I said. After she left, I looked at the sketch again. The hands seemed to shimmer in the fading, light and finished, yes, but alive with possibility. I tore the page from the book, folded it gently, and let the wind take it. It sailed a few feet before landing in the water, where the ink began to blur, the lines dissolving into the current, and I smiled, because ain't creature bastard. It was about what touched the world, even for a moment. Over the following months, I built a quiet rhythm painting, walking, sometimes talking with the woman from the pier. Her name, I eventually learned, was Lena. She was a teacher. Though she spoke of her work with the same reverence I once had for art, children are the only ones who steal things for what they are. Séance. Adults just try to name them. I began helping her at the local school. We turned an unused storeroom into a small art space. We didn't call it a museum. We didn't lock anything away. The children painted, sculpted, built things from driftwood and clay. Some of it lasted a day, some an hour. It didn't matter. One afternoon, a girl no older than 8 came to me holding a lump of clay. "It's not pretty," she said, frowning. "Maybe not yet," I said, kneeling beside her. "But do you like making it?" She nodded. "Then it's already beautiful." She smiled, shy but radiant, and went back to work. That night, as the sun sank over the ocean, I realized that for all my years of chasing, meaning through grandeur, wealth, and rebellion, the truest kind of beauty had always been the simplest, the act of creating for its own sake. I wrote a letter to the board of the museum, not a manifesto, not a confession. Just a thank you. I told her now, Tata didn't teach anymore, and I never said. I tore it up, watched the pieces scatter across the sand. Because some messages, like art, weren't meant to be kept. As I walked home that evening, I passed a small gallery by the harbor. In the window hung a new exhibition. Poster, the Amara Quinn collection, traveling display, beneath it. A smaller line read, curated by Mara Ellison. I stopped and laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that tastes like relief. They had brought the art to the world at last. Not locked behind walls, not owned by anyone, just shared. And somewhere in the rhythm of the waves and wind I thought I heard her voice again, Mara's or Amara's, or maybe both, gentle, steady, eternal. "You finally understood, Ethan. You didn't destroy art. You set it free." I looked out toward the horizon, where the last light of day shimmered, like glass, and I whispered back, smiling no. "You did." Then I walked into the evening, not as the man who once owned too much or the one who lost everything, trying to save it, but as someone who finally learned that freedom, in the end, was just another word for love uncontained. I left the city a week later. No announcements, no goodbyes, not even a note to the board. I packed a single bag, locked the door of my apartment for the last time, and took the first train heading nowhere. In particular, the museum would go on without me now, stronger, for my absence finally untethered. From the name that had once tried to define it, the rhythm of the train lulled me into thought. The landscape blurred into watercolor, endless. Fields, power lines stretching like veins across the horizon. I watched my reflection in the window, and for the first time in years it didn't feel like a stranger. Staring back, I stopped in a small coastal town, one of those places where time seemed to move slower, where the air smelled of salt and wood smoke. No one recognized me, and that anonymity felt like a gift. I rented a room above a bookstore run by an old couple who never asked questions. Days slipped into a kind of peace I hadn't known was possible. I began painting again, not for show, not for money, just to see what would happen when my hands moved without agenda. My first piece was a mess, wild strokes of ochre and black smeared by impatience, the second comma, the third alive. By the fifth, I realized something profound. Art had never been about preservation or permanence. It was about conversation. Each brushstroke whispered something only the next could answer. Sometimes I thought about Amara, about the way she'd smile mid-sentence as if her words were chasing something bigger than language. Other times I thought about Mara and the quiet defiance in her eyes when she told me I'd turned art into a tomb. Both women lived in the space between who I'd been and who I was becoming. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I walked to the pier. The ocean was calm, a vast mirror of orange and violet. I sat on the edge, feet dangling above the water, sketchbook open on my lap. I drew without thinking, lines flowing as if they already existed, and I was just uncovering them. When I was done, I looked at what I'd made. It was a pair of hands open, reaching unfinished. I laughed softly. You're still teaching me, I said aloud, not sure if I was talking to Amara, to Mara, or to something else entirely. Behind me, footsteps approached. Light, deliberate, beautiful. A voice said. I turned. A woman stood there, perhaps in her 30s, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. She wore a linen coat the color of sand, and had eyes that seemed to hold questions rather than judgment. Sorry, she said, smiling, didn't mean to startle you. I've seen you sketching here the last few evenings. Thought you might want some company. I hesitated, then nodded. Company's fine. She handed me a cup. It's just coffee, she added. Not a metaphor. I chuckled. That's a relief. We sat in silence for a while, sipping, watching the waves. You're not from here, she said eventually. No, I replied, just passing through. She glanced at the sketchbook. Artist trying to be human. First, I said. Her smile deepened. Aren't we all? We didn't exchange names that night. We didn't need to. The world had been built on too many names, too many labels. Sometimes the absence of definition was what made things real. As the sky darkened, she rose to leave. I come here most evenings, she said. If you want to talk again, I might, I said. After she left, I looked at the sketch again. The hands seemed to shimmer in the fading light, unfinished, yes, but alive with possibility. I tore the page from the book, folded it gently, and let the wind take it. It sailed a few feet before landing in the water, where the ink began to blur, the lines dissolving into the current, and I smiled, because that was the point. Creation wasn't about what lasted, it was about what touched the world, even for a moment. Over the following months, I built a quiet rhythm, painting, walking, sometimes talking with the woman from the pier. Her name, I eventually learned, was Lena. She was a teacher, though. She spoke of her work with the same reverence I once had for art. Children are the only ones who still see things for what they are, she said. Once adults just try to name them. I began helping her at the local school. We turned an unused storeroom into a small art space. We didn't call it a museum. We didn't lock anything away. The children painted, sculpted, built things from driftwood and clay. Some of it lasted a day, some an hour. It didn't matter. One afternoon, a girl no older than 8 came to me holding a lump of clay. It's not pretty, she said, frowning. Maybe not yet, I said, kneeling beside her. But do you like making it? She nodded. Then it's already beautiful. She smiled, shy but radiant, and went back to work. That night, as the sun sank over the ocean, I realized that for all my years of chasing meaning through grandeur, wealth, and rebellion, the truest kind of beauty had always been the simplest, the act of creating for its own sake. I wrote a letter to the board of the museum, not a manifesto, not a confession, just a thank you. I told them that I'd found what I was looking for, that art didn't need a guardian anymore, and neither did I. I never sent it. I tore it up, watched the pieces scatter across the sand. Because some messages, like art, home. That evening, I passed a small gallery by the harbor. In the window hung a new exhibition poster, the Amara Quinn Collection traveling display. Beneath it, a smaller line read, curated by Mara Ellison. I stopped and laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that tastes like relief. They had brought the art to the world at last. Not locked behind walls, not owned by anyone, just shared. And somewhere, in the rhythm of the waves and wind, I thought, hey, her voice a gemorous, all me but gentle, steady turn. You finally understood, Ethan. You didn't destroy art, you set it free. I looked out toward the horizon, where the last light of day shimmered like glass. And I whispered back, smiling, no, you did. Then I walked into the evening. Not as the man who once owned too much, or the one who lost everything trying to save it, but as someone who finally learned that freedom, in the end, was just another word for love uncontained. Years passed. Seasons folded into one another, like pages of a well-read book, and the rhythm of the little coastal town became the quiet heartbeat of my new life. I grew older, not in the brittle way of years, but in the softened way of understanding. The museum thrived in my absence. I saw it only through fleeting mentions in newspapers, short video clips on art programs, the occasional photograph of schoolchildren staring in awe at pieces that once sat untouched in my private vaults. Each image felt like a letter from another lifetime, reminding me that meaning didn't need a keeper. Lena and I grew close, though never in a way that demanded definition. We built something gentle, to people walking parallel paths, sometimes meeting, sometimes drifting apart, always returning to the pier when the world grew too loud. The art space at her school had become a living thing of its own. The children painted murals that the sea wind slowly wore away, only for them to begin again. They learned that beauty wasn't about keeping, it was about doing. On my 63rd birthday, the mailman brought me a package with no sender's name. Ainsi doit. Single photograph, hands of glass still standing beneath the skylight, still open to the world. And taped to the back, in familiar handwriting, were 6 words, you finally kept your promise. I sat with it for a long time. The sun moved across the room, touching the edges of the photo until the glass in the image seemed to glow. I remembered every version of myself that had come before, ambitious, wounded, righteous, lost, and felt them dissolve. One by one, until only quiet remained. That evening, I walked to the beach alone. The horizon was painted in silver, the tide low and whispering. I carried no sketchbook this time, no tools of ownership or legacy. Just the photograph. I let the wind take it, watched it flutter like a fragile bird before landing on the waves and drifting away. And there, as dusk spread its soft hand across the sea, I finally understood what Amora had been trying to teach me from the beginning. Art wasn't meant to last forever. Neither was love, or grief, or the people who carried them. What mattered was the brief miracle of creation, the pulse between giving and letting go, the courage to leave something behind without needing to be remembered for it. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt air. Somewhere behind me, children laughed, painting the rocks, no doubt, with colors that would be gone by morning. The sound carried across the wind, bright and fleeting, like the final note of a song that didn't need to be repeated. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon shimmered with light. And in that moment, I wasn't the man who had donated $40 million or the one who tried to own freedom. I was simply Ethan, a small part of a larger, endless work of art that no one could ever buy, sell, or name. The sea kept its rhythm, the sky kept its color, and for the first time, everything was enough. The story that began with loss ended, at last, with release. And somewhere, in the quiet between waves, I heard a voice, soft, familiar, smiling through eternity. Now, it's beautiful. Please paste your script here. I have understood your commands.